Hi, I'm Kurt Fernley and welcome to 1+1. Megan Davis is one of the key people behind the Uluru Statement from the Heart and also the push for constitutional change to bring an Indigenous voice into Parliament. We caught up to talk about fairness, hope and rugby league.
We call for the establishment of a First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution. In 1967, we were counted. In 2017, we seek to be heard. Makarrata is the culmination of our agenda, the coming together after a struggle. It captures our aspirations for a fair and truthful relationship with the people of Australia and a better future for our children based on justice and self-determination.
Professor Megan Davis, welcome to 1+1.
Thank you for having me.
I didn't know that we had so much in common.
A lot.
Your family are incredible rugby league fans. You are from 5 kids in the family, 2 girls, 3 boys. You're a pro-chancellor of a university. I'm a pro-chancellor of a university. You're a professor. I'm a fake professor.
I'm a fake professor too. They gave me one last year.
Yeah, but you're...
I mean, I've got a real one too.
Your real one's a lot fancier than my fake one. I love the story about your connection to reading and the importance that your family put on reading. Tell me about growing up and the importance of books.
Yeah, I mean, Mum was a prolific reader, so she was always reading and still always is, right? She's 83 and, you know, I spend a lot of money on books for her. She churns through them. We know when she's sick because she doesn't read, and then we know when she's getting better because she starts churning through books again. And so she did kind of pass that on to all of us. Books were really important in our house. We didn't have a lot of money, and with the little disposable income that she had, she spent it on anything to do with team sports. So we all played netball, rugby league, soccer, that kind of thing. But the rest of it would go on secondhand books. We used to roll our eyes every payday when she'd come home with a backpack full of books from the local secondhand bookshop. But I mean, on reflection, I can see what she was doing. There is some research that shows that, you know, there's a strong link between books in the home and bookcases and social mobility. And so all my siblings were prolific readers, and I think whether it was poetry, so romantic poetry in particular she liked, or the classics. So we were very schooled in the kind of Western canon, and because she was an English teacher, you know, it taught us a lot, I think, when on reflection about the ways in which we think about the world and see the world and react to things. And, you know, you can learn a lot as a child reading about human nature and humankind. You
were the middle, I was the youngest. The middle is usually the negotiator.
I'm the diplomat.
Yeah, the diplomat. Yeah. When there's 5 kids around the table, you've got to figure out what's going on. Do you think that actually led you, or put you in good stead at the career that you...
I think so. I think I negotiated lots of things. I think I was always the kind of middle... Yeah, diplomat, I think is a good word. And you are kind of... There's different factions across the family when we were little, and there's different factions now, and you're just trying to work out what's what and finding the best way forward. I mean, I think all of the siblings try to do that, but that's kind of me stuck in the middle. Mum used to forget I was there, actually. She'd hate me saying that, but she'd put out all the dessert and I'd just be sitting there and she'd be, oh, and I'd have no dessert. She'd be like, Maxie, I forgot, you're so quiet, I forgot you were there. I'd just be like, okay. So she would forget me a lot because I was so quiet. Probably because I was reading in the corner. But yeah, so I think it probably did set me up for my diplomatic career at the UN, yeah.
I think that's the conversations that's been had by every middle child forever. I think that's my middle child. My sibling in the middle is I don't think Mum even knew I was there half the time.
Yeah, no, she didn't. I was just invisible
I don't know whether it's urban
because
legend.
I was so good. Fact.
Fact, okay. Because we can't actually fact check that, I'm going to just take
Don't
it.
ring any of my siblings. None of them are on Twitter either. So
I don't know whether this is urban legend or not. So you do have stories.
when you
about
start that scares me.
Would you read the Constitution as a kid?
I did. I mean, not every night. Probably from about grade 6, yeah.
Why?
Well, Mum bought me a book, a second-hand book. I was homesick one day and she'd come back with books, which is what she'd bring you, in addition to soup. Hey, here's a political book. It was a biography of Sir John Kerr about the double disillusion, and then it had the Constitution at the back of the book. So I read it and then I started reading the Constitution because it was in the text, and that's what you do, you read the whole book. So that became I used to carry that around because I had the Constitution in the back.
I don't know. I think that a lot of Aussies kind
You're
of...
making me sound like a nerd. Let's move on to the NRL.
Well, the breadth of my knowledge when it came to reading books was Star Wars books, and they were read along books. But I think that makes me nerd because I'm still reading them.
Yeah, it does. It really does.
A lot of Australians may not even know what's in our Constitution. We're probably more familiar with the US Constitution than our own. What is the power in a Constitution?
We are more familiar, actually, with the American Constitution. Civic studies have shown that. But look, the Constitution really is, I mean, the most kind of shortest way to say it is it is the rule book for the nation. So it's an important document because it distributes power across the Federation. And it may seem like that doesn't impact upon our lives, you know, living in Logan City or Eagleby or living in Sydney, but it does because it determines what state governments can do, how resources are allocated towards you. I mean, Australians learned a lot about this in COVID, the ways in which resources were allocated and who made decisions on vaccines and who made decisions on shutdowns and lockdowns. But the Constitution really dominates all of our lives all the time. It's just that it's a kind of pretty functioning document. It's served the nation pretty well. I obviously have some caveats to make about that, but it's it is a pretty functional document. And so we don't really think about it a lot because we don't have a lot of constitutional political crisis as a consequence of that text. There are limits to that comment, but for most Australians, it is the rule book. I hate to talk in rugby league questions. You know, that thing
You're
where
speaking my language.
It is the rule book. It's how the High Court, the referees, it is how they determine. And if the Parliament oversteps or exceeds their power, they're the guys that say, yeah, they pull the whistle, blow the whistle, and I'm going to cross sports, and then you've got to pull up stumps on whatever you're doing. Because it's not lawful. So that's it. You know, the High Court's the umpire and they are the rules.
I loved it. And you've crossed multiple sports in the one response. So I am all over this. Everything that I talk about is within the fields of play. Yeah,
so great.
We're good. I'm gonna read this, and I don't know when people read parts of my bio out, I shut up, but I'm going to. You were the first Aboriginal Australian elected to the UN body that you later chaired. That's the United Nations Permanent Forum, selected as a member of the experts panel on constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians. And in 2015, when the federal government and the opposition came together to appoint a referendum council that again included yourself, you're now considered one of the architects of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. And you're a key figure when it comes to the conversation around establishing a voice in the Constitution. When you hear that, how does that land? How do you feel?
I feel old. Because I actually started on the expert panel with Gillard in late 2010, 2011, same time as I started my first role on the United Nations. Constitutional recognition has been going for 11 years now in Australia, and I was on that first panel. So I feel like we're coming to an appropriate, not end, but resolution of the lack of recognition in this nation for First Nations people. Yeah, 7 processes and 10 reports in 11 years. It's not a small thing. It's been a big piece of work that the Australian nation and the Australian people have been undertaking. And now we've got a commitment from a Prime Minister and we're heading towards a referendum. So yeah, it's kind of exciting times, but it's been a lot of work to get here.
I believe this country is ready for this reform. If not now, when?
There will be a referendum to amend the Constitution. What essentially is being asked?
That First Nations have a say in the laws and policies that impact upon them. Now, when they have that say, it doesn't bind the Parliament. The Parliament doesn't have to go along with what it is that First Nations are saying. But the issue is that we're at the table when those laws and policies are made and when those decisions are made. That's the amendment. The amendment is for the Parliament to set up a First Nations voice, and that the Parliament is tasked with the job of supervising what that looks like. So they will pass it in legislation at a later point. You don't put the bricks and mortar or something like that in a constitution. So the enabling provision is what Australians will vote on, and then the Parliament will set about that process of designing what the voice looks like. But I think there's a couple of things that I'd say where about how it's been received by Australians. I think Australians do see it as a fair thing. I think the polling shows that. I think most Australians can see that closing the gap, for example, and all of the other many attempts we've had to address and mitigate disadvantage hasn't worked. And one of the reasons for that is there's so few Indigenous people putting input into that. You know, a lot of what is done in our communities is controlled by an agency in Canberra. And how would they know how our people live in communities? How would they know what decisions to make on behalf of our communities? And, well, they don't. And we can see that manifested in just the ongoing disadvantage, whether it's justice measures, health measures, education measures, right across the board if you look at, say, the Closing the Gap framework. So Australians can see that, and then we say, well, one of the problems is we're not involved in a lot of this. We are not at the table, our voice is not at the table, and even if some are, they're not listening.
Well, that's what I wanted to expand on as well, is that what are the consequences now? The consequences now of not having a voice to Parliament. What are we living through because of that absence?
I mean, when I look back to the dialogues and when we ran the dialogues, there had been a new policy introduced by the Abbott government called the Indigenous Advancement Strategy. And what it did was take all of the money for Indigenous Australia and they pulled it all and put it into one bucket. And so all of these kind of organisations and programs and policies that existed in communities were just cut overnight, and all you got was a phone call and a letter saying no more, and you've got to reapply. And what we heard in the dialogues then a couple of years later was the destructive, probably 3 or 4 years later, really destructive impact of that policy upon communities, because the government never looked, the Razor Gang never looked to see what they were abolishing. So they were abolishing, you know, employment programs, cultural programs, some of the violence against women measures, such as safe houses and things like that, that protected Aboriginal women from violence during things like Pay Week. Lots of really kind of finely granular programs that First Nations peoples have created to within their own communities to tailor to their own communities. They were all just pulled, whether they work or not. That's one of the biggest impact on everybody's lives now, you know. And that decision-making about who gets resources isn't done by anyone in our communities. It's done by non-Indigenous bureaucrats in Canberra. That's just one example, though. There's many examples where decisions about communities are taken from, you know, Canberra or the regional cities without talking to any community.
You mentioned the dialogues. What were they?
The dialogues was a series of meetings that we designed to go out into community and elicit from them a sample of what the community were thinking about constitutional recognition. So prior to the dialogues, no one had actually gone out and asked communities what they thought was meaningful recognition. So we needed to make sure that the dialogues were Indigenous-led and only Indigenous populated and constituted and run by Indigenous organisations. We look back on it now and go, wow, that was an amazing experience. But at the time, we were just really wanting to get an idea from the community about what they thought meaningful constitutional recognition was.
We like to consider ourselves as a nation that lives this ideals around a fair go. What are your thoughts around that?
I think that I think one of the reasons the Uluru Statement resonates with Australians is because it speaks to fairness. Because I think Australians accept in many facets of Australian life that while we say we're all equal, we understand that's also an abstract notion. Not everybody is equal, and some people need a hand up. And I think that's imbued through our universal healthcare system, our welfare system, social housing. There's many things that kept lid on social tensions through COVID in Australia that other countries don't have. Just the very notion of everyone staying home and how successfully we did that. You know, we don't look at things in that abstract sense. We know that, you know, if you're born into poverty, you might need a hand up. And so I think Australians just get that, you know what, you will have better outcomes for First Nations people if you have them at the table. Just makes sense.
You're negotiating now at a period of time that is leading into the referendum, and there is conversations and some of them, I'm sure, extremely genuine, but there's some disingenuous arguments that are also popping up. That how are you negotiating that landscape? What do you follow? What do you know, where do you put your time and your effort, and how do you prosecute a case in what is a pretty complicated area for the next 6 months?
It's a good question. I mean, we talk to so many Australians, I wouldn't even know how to calculate just how many communities and corporations and unis and schools we've spoken to. Travelled around for 5 years with the Uluru painting. You know, we've done a lot and we got to this point. And I think we're kind of adopting the same approach we adopted before, which is you can't get distracted by the disingenuous. We issued the Uluru Statement from the heart to the Australian people. They are the key players in this space. Not only are all those politicians there to represent those people, but only Australians can change the Constitution. Yeah, not people who write op-eds. It's the Australian people. They have the agency, and their agency needs to be activated and animated in the way that it is in many other areas. You know, the polling has shown that a majority of Australians would support this, and that's over 5 years. It's not something that binds the Parliament. It's not something that the Parliament has to listen to, but it will change the nature of politics.
When we have power over our destiny, our children will flourish. They will walk in two worlds, and their culture will be a gift to their country. And we invite you to walk with us in a movement of the Australian people for a better future.
That statement that's an invitation to Australians. We issued it to Aussies, and it is our argument to them. It is our kind of very earnest logic to them. Comms people would call it a pitch. As to why we need change. And it's all in that statement.
And the statement is filled with hope.
It is filled with hope.
Hope to not just Indigenous Australians and Torres Strait Islanders, but hope to the Australian people. How do you define that hope? What part of that statement is the hope for the country?
I think most Australians want some, not resolution, because these things are never resolved, right? Because it's dispossessed country. And that's part of the truth-telling component to Uluru, right? This conversation will never end. We will continue to have it. We need to talk about the frontier wars and the killings We need to talk about the protection era and compulsory racial segregation, what happened in the assimilation period with stolen gens. We have to talk about stolen wages. There's so much for the nation to talk about, and to be frank, before we could even get to the constitutional discussions and the dialogues, we had to talk about Australian history, because so many of our people in each of the meetings were saying, don't they want to know? Don't Australians want to know what happened to us in our own country? There was a very earnest, well, it was a very earnest question, because a lot of people feel like Australians don't want to know. But I think they do. I think that's a big part of Uluru as well. What we're saying is, by doing this, by recognising us in the Constitution, because it's a substantive recognition as well as symbolic recognition, you're actually unlocking for all Australians this incredible culture that we all live in and amongst. Australians are born on country, they live on country, they work on someone's country, they die on someone's country. I learned so much from the dialogues from the old people who were in the dialogue, and it really profoundly changed me. And one of the key things was their sense of generosity, the forgiving nature of the way that they speak, and the way they speak about hope for their young people and their grannies, and their hope for the future. And I think that was a lot of what they invested in this process that we undertook with them, because law reform's a difficult thing. And when we went to each room or each dialogue, we would say, you need to suspend your disbelief that this nation cannot change. Law reform is about imagination and dreaming of a better day, that Australia can change and that we can do this. The old people, they led the 1967 referendum. They've seen the agency of the Australian people walking with First Nations people already in 1967, and they're not remotely hesitant about this. They say that we did it once and we can do it again. And they believe, they're very earnest about their belief in the inherent good nature of the Australian people to get this done. And they're like, we'll be fine, we know them, we live among them. It'll be fine. It was just an extraordinary thing to experience.
You're now a part of a process that could alter the Australian Constitution. How do you switch off away from that? How do you stop at the moment?
I watch movies about the Constitution on Netflix. Well, I'm very good at downtime. I read.
What do you read?
I read books about the UN, Congo. I have particular interest. I read a lot of Aboriginal history and politics books. I read a lot about treaties and other. I'm starting to sound like I don't know. I do. I'm very good at downtime. I watch NRL games, a lot of rugby league.
Tell me about what rugby league meant to you and your family when you were younger.
Rugby league is everything to my family, but I think it is to most Aboriginal families and communities, especially in Queensland and New South Wales. It's just everything. Your whole life revolves around it, really. You know, my father and his family were involved in Hervey Bay and the kind of setting up the first Aboriginal rugby league team. Rugby league was always a really big part of the Baramba Reserve, or the Cherbourg Reserve, where a lot of my family had lived and still live. Go Cherbourg Hornets. And when I, got my family file from the archives from the Queensland government, we also pulled a lot of news stories written about Cherbourg and rugby league. So it was really interesting to see the ways in which Aboriginal men who lived under such draconian laws in which men and women could not leave the reserve or missions. This was in any part of New South Wales or Queensland and other parts of the country without permission. Rugby league was one of the things that they did get permission to leave the reserve to play in white teams and in Aboriginal teams. And I'm not being a Pollyanna about racism and what happened in the protection era, but rugby league did play a really important role in terms of race relations. The other thing I have to say about rugby league is it really, for me, it's why I was so successful in grade 10, 11 and 12, because we just obsessively followed it. And we'd be home for, Friday night football and Saturday games. We'd watch the schoolboys come off Bank Cup, and then we'd watch Saturday night and then Sunday night football and around the grounds on ABC radio. And we'd just study in and out. We'd do our schedules and study in and out around the games. And the games would regulate our study periods. So it was everything to us. Reading Rugby League Week when it came in every week, and it would be just completely ripped to bits by the end of the round. It was, league remains a big part of my life, obviously, now that I'm on the commission.
You said that it's rugby league can be a great example of reconciliation. What do you mean by that?
I think in Australia, what I learnt from the Uluru Dialogues is the word reconciliation is wrong, because it means coming together, like you had a prior relationship and you've had a dispute and you come together and you reconcile. So what a lot of the old people said is, that's the wrong word. And that's a big part of Uluru. It's about meeting for the first time. And I think that's what I mean when I talk about rugby league. I think the early days, I used the word reconciliation, but it was actually the meeting for the first time between the settler population and the Aboriginal population on the football field. And as I said before, I don't want to be Pollyanna about race and racism, but race relations are messy and they're complex. And we kind of live in a world in which, there's not a lot of room for complexity, and nuance. But I think that's what I mean. I mean, it is a way in which, with rugby league, we take our Aboriginal communities and fans, our players really, really seriously. It's a really deeply imbued part of rugby league and what rugby league is. And you can see that in our Indigenous round and All-Stars. But throughout the season, we take it very, very seriously. And I think that's a lot about what this is. There are a lot of Australians and a lot of rugby league fans who don't meet a lot of Aboriginal people, or know a lot of Aboriginal people. So that role sport can play in making Aboriginal issues, Indigenous First Nations issues more understandable, comprehensible to those portions of the population that might not know, is really important.
What's your hope?
That the Cowboys win the grand final. That Queensland continues to win the State of Origin.
Oh, no!
I think I can say things like that. Oh, yeah, you're Blues.
Yes.
What's my hope? I hope First Nations communities are able to design the voice that they want after a referendum. That's my hope.
Megan Davis, thanks for joining me on 1+1.
Thanks for having me.